What was life like in Shanghai during the recent heavy fighting with China? I can tell you. I was there. More than that, I'll tell you of the contrast of life in Japan, only a few score miles across the Yellow Sea. Shanghai might well be a city of the dead after 10 o'clock at night. There isn't a sound of a motor car, not a civilian footstep, not one hastening shadow in all that immense city. Swiftly and excitingly in the harassed city, where war sweeps a tragic pall of smoke over a countryside, across a people, and yet where there is an oasis of safety, protected by the ready guns of the foreign warships in the Wangpu River. This is the international settlement, where more than 100,000 Europeans and Americans, while not technically besieged, live under the conditions of a siege. Shanghai, the Pearl of the Orient, presents a modern face to approaching ships. There are towering office and bank buildings. There is commercial intensity in the air, the spirit of the 20th century. But in its narrow native streets, outside the settlement, there is a sudden about-face, an echo of the ancient, inscrutable China. Shanghai is a city of contrasts. 100,000 Europeans and Americans dominating 1 million Chinese. A city of strangeness. And nothing is more strange than the war outside the borders of the international settlement, the war that approaches within a literal foot of it, yet leaves it physically untouched. You know there's a war when you're in Shanghai, not so much by the rumble of distant guns, as by the deserted shops and offices. Every man in the settlement is assigned a definite period for duty on the barricades and fortifications. Business, as a result, is paralyzed. During the day, the thunder of firing is drowned in the noises of the city. But when night comes on, after the curfew rings at 10 o'clock, then you can distinctly hear the bombardment. I was there when the Wusang forts were stormed. I don't know how they ever held out so long against such an onslaught from air, land, and sea. The first thing a stranger learns in Shanghai is that curfew is 10 o'clock. Nobody breaks it. My supposed arrest makes a good story, but it doesn't happen to be true. Restaurants close at 9 or 9:30. No theaters, no motion pictures are open at night. But everyone in the settlement takes the war and its restrictions philosophically. You hear very little complaint. After a manner, they have had this sort of thing on and off for a good many years. The wall around the settlement has been maintained, and Shanghai has never been unprepared for war, though the war expected was won among the Chinese themselves. This is where the white and yellow races meet in Shanghai, on the Bund, the waterfront boulevard, in the international settlement. Here, 100,000 whites are surrounded by 1 million Chinese. In the daytime, noises of traffic drowned out the roar of bombardment. But at night there was not a sound on this once gay thoroughfare. During my stay, a hotel advertised a dance from 9 in the evening until 4 in the morning. And that meant that if you attended, you had to remain there until street traffic was permitted at dawn the next morning. If there were parties, they had to last all night. I went out with my uncle and cousins, who live in Shanghai and whom I visited, to see the barricades, which are placed at strategic spots in the settlement. Outside the walls, there was constant fighting in the ruins of Chapei. From the protection of the barricades, we saw hand-to-hand skirmishing, not a block away. But within, it was safe. Thousands of native women and children entered for refuge. We saw proof that the Japanese bombing planes are unerring in their accuracy. Where only a narrow street separates the international district from Chapay, the native district, small bombs had been placed so perfectly that houses on the Chinese side were destroyed, while those on the neutral side were intact. In many instances, we saw shell holes within a half-foot of the fortifications. Japan is mighty careful not to give the powers any excuse for interference. Everyone in China is fairly well accustomed to excitement, but they are getting weary of it. I talked to many Europeans and Americans who expressed themselves as not caring who won, so long as a lasting peace resulted, with a government strong enough to subdue banditry and enforce law. It looked peaceful and prosperous, not ominous at all. It was almost inconceivable that death and destruction surrounded it. When will it end? No one in Shanghai even ventures to guess. The boat on which I sailed for Kobe, Japan, was convoyed out of the harbor by a Japanese man-of-war as protection against snipers on shore. Shanghai lay behind us, incredibly big and important, with a skyline much like Philadelphia's. In Japan, by contrast, there seems to be very little excitement about the war. There is beauty, breathtaking beauty, on every hand. The gardens are like exquisite dreams. From Kobe, I went to Kyoto, and here theaters, restaurants are excessively crowded. Everyone is busy, and all Japan is decidedly movie-conscious. Fans collect autographs and photographs, and since it is considered undignified for women to approach strangers, the man of the family is delegated to secure the autographs. I was never asked for just one autograph, but usually from 4 to a dozen. The men evidently had very explicit instructions from the feminine members of their households. The Japanese have beautiful manners, and with all the volume of interest and attention bestowed upon me, I didn't feel that embarrassment I've experienced before from the onslaughts of fans in other parts of the world. The Japanese crowd always follows at discreet distances. I met up with Jessica and Richard Barthelmess in Kyoto, and we did many interesting things together. For one thing, we went to a motion picture studio and saw silence being made. We couldn't figure out whether it was a tragedy or a comedy. Their technique, I should judge, compares with that of Hollywood some 6 or 7 years ago. Their themes are based on Japanese life and are made for home consumption. They haven't started making talkies as yet, but they take great delight in them. Motion picture theaters in Japan do not remove the soundtrack, with English spoken, of course, but place an interpreter right next to the screen, and he explains the gags to the audience as they happen. And it was terribly amusing to us to see an audience rocking with laughter over some action that occurred a bit back, while the screen by then was showing something entirely different. The Japanese film fans are intensely interested in America, and their theaters primarily show American-made pictures. Before reaching the Orient, I spent considerable time in Europe. As a matter of fact, the Depression is a tangible, hideous condition in all of Europe. Resorts everywhere, whether in southern France, Italy, or Germany, are empty. Neither the English nor the Americans have the money to spend now. There is very little travel and crossing of borders in Europe now. No one is permitted to take money out of one continental country into another above a certain sum. If a man really wants to have his ego deflated, he ought to go to Europe and try to cash a check. Ronald Colman? Cashiers shrugged their shoulders. The name meant nothing to them, or to customs inspectors.